Welcome back to Whispers of the Abyss, the channel where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature. The stories we share are not for the faint of heart. They are accounts of events so disturbing, they blur the line between reality and nightmare. Today's story is one that will linger with you long after the screen goes dark. A tale of such macabre depravity it almost defies belief. We're about to journey to a remote, isolated farm where the line between predator and prey was horrifically redrawn. Before we pull back the curtain on this chilling case, if you're drawn to the shadows and fascinated by the mysteries that lie within, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Now, turn down the lights and prepare yourselves for the unspeakable tale of the Ostrich Horror Farm. It belonged to a man named Silas Croft, a long-haul trucker who'd been trying to reach his cousin, a drifter named Leo, for the better part of a week. He was supposed to call me. See, Silas explained, his words tumbling over each other. Always calls on a Sunday, never misses it. Said he'd found some work, some farmhand gig out past Miller's Ridge, the Albright place. Said the pay was good, but the folks were odd. Miles scribbled the names onto a legal pad. Albright. He didn't know them. Miller's Ridge was on the far edge of their jurisdiction, a stretch of arid, unforgiving land where properties were measured in square miles, not acres. It was the kind of place people went when they didn't want to be found. Odd how, Mr. Croft? Miles asked, his voice a low, tired rumble. He just said they were strange, quiet, kept to themselves. And they raise ostriches. Silas said the last word as if it were an exotic, slightly embarrassing secret. Who the hell raises ostriches out here? Leo thought it was a hoot. Sent me a picture of one of them big birds staring him down. That was the last I heard from him. A missing persons report on a transient farmhand wasn't exactly a high priority case, especially for a man like Leo Croft who, according to his cousin, had a habit of disappearing for weeks on end. But something in Silas's voice, a genuine, gnawing fear made Miles pause. That and the ostriches. It was just weird enough to be interesting. All right, Mr. Croft. We'll send a car out to the Albright farm for a wellness check. I'll handle it myself, Miles said. A decision he made in the split second he pictured another mountain of paperwork. A drive out to the ridge was better than that, at least. His partner, Detective Lena Petrova, raised a skeptical eyebrow from across their shared desk. She was younger, sharper, and hadn't yet had the optimism beaten out of her by the relentless monotony of small-town law enforcement. A wellness check for a drifter who's been off the grid for 5 days? On an ostrich farm? She asked, a smirk playing on her lips. Sounds like a wild goose chase, Miles. Or a wild ostrich chase, I suppose. It's better than this, he grumbled, gesturing to the stacks of files. Come on. Fresh air will do you good. And who knows? Maybe you'll get to see a bird taller than you. Lena, who stood at a proud 5'3", shot him a withering glare before grabbing her jacket. The drive to Miller's Ridge was a slow descent into isolation. The paved roads gave way to gravel, and then to a deeply rutted dirt track that threatened to swallow the patrol car's tires. The landscape grew sparse, the trees stunted and grasping, the earth a parched, dusty red. It was a place that felt perpetually thirsty. After nearly an hour of jostling and cursing, they saw it. The Albright farm wasn't so much a farm as it was a scar on the land. A ramshackle 2-story house, its paint peeled away by sun and time to reveal the gray, splintered wood beneath, stood like a weathered tombstone. A sagging porch wrapped around it, cluttered with rusting tools and unidentifiable junk. A large, dilapidated barn stood a few hundred yards away, its roof patched with mismatched sheets of corrugated tin. But the most arresting feature was the fencing. Tall, heavy-gauge chain-link fences at least 10 feet high enclosed vast, dusty paddocks. And inside them, stalking with an unnerving, prehistoric grace, were the ostriches. They were enormous, far larger than Miles had imagined. Towering creatures with long, muscular necks and legs that looked powerful enough to kick a dent in their patrol car. Their heads, small and reptilian, swiveled on sinuous necks, and their huge black eyes, fringed with ludicrously long lashes, watched the cars approach with an unnerving, unblinking intelligence. There were dozens of them, scattered across several pens, their silent, jerky movements adding to the profound sense of unease that hung over the property. Miles parked the car near the porch. The air was thick with the smell of dust, dry manure, and something else. Something acrid and vaguely sweet, like spoiled meat left too long in the sun. "Charming place," Lena muttered, her hand resting instinctively on the butt of her service weapon. As they stepped out of the car, the silence was broken by a low, guttural hissing sound from the nearest pen. An ostrich, larger than the rest, had approached the fence. It stared at them, its head cocked, its beak slightly agape. "I think it likes you," Miles said, trying to break the tension. "I think it wants to wear my skin as a hat," Lena retorted, not taking her eyes off the creature. They approached the house, their boots crunching on the gravel. The windows were dark and grimy, like clouded eyes. Miles knocked on the door, the sound echoing flatly in the oppressive quiet. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. A floorboard creaked somewhere inside. After a long moment, the door opened a crack. A woman's face appeared in the gloom. She was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, her hair a wiry, colorless gray pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes were pale, washed-out blue, and they darted between Miles and Lena with a skittish, animal suspicion. "We're closed," she said, her voice a dry rasp, as if her throat were coated in the same dust that covered everything else on the farm. "Ma'am, we're not here to buy anything," Miles said, holding up his badge. "Detective Corbin, Havenwood Sheriff's Department. This is Detective Petrova. We're looking for a man named Leo Croft. We were told he was working here." The woman's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something fear, or maybe anger passed through her pale eyes. "Don't know him." "His cousin said he was here," Lena pressed, her tone polite but firm. "Said he started about a week ago. Tall guy, lanky, tattoo of a snake on his forearm. Lots of folks come and go. Can't keep track of them all," the woman said, starting to close the door. Miles put a hand on it, gently stopping its movement. "We have reason to be concerned for his well-being, ma'am. We just need to have a look around, talk to Mr. Albright, and we'll be on our way." "Hezekiah's not here," she snapped, "and you're not coming on my property without a warrant." The door slammed shut, the bolt shooting home with a heavy, final thud. Miles and Lena exchanged a look. "Well, that was friendly," Lena said. "Hezekiah," Miles mused. "Sounds biblical. And she sounds like she's got something to hide." They were legally stymied. They had no probable cause for a warrant. A missing persons report on an unreliable drifter wasn't enough to justify a forced entry. But retreating felt wrong. The isolation of the farm, the woman's instant hostility, the strange, sickly sweet smell on the air, it all coalesced into a knot of suspicion in Miles's gut. "Let's take a walk around the perimeter," he decided. "Publicly accessible areas. See what we can see from the fence line." They started with the pens closest to the house. The ostriches tracked their every move, their huge eyes following them with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. They were powerful, alien-looking creatures, dinosaurs in everything but name. The ground in their pens was churned and dusty, littered with feathers and droppings. As they moved further from the house, towards the large barn, the foul smell intensified. It was a thick, cloying stench of rot and decay, strong enough to make them gag. Lena pulled the collar of her shirt over her nose. "Smells like a slaughterhouse," she choked out. "They probably butcher the birds here for meat," Miles reasoned, though the smell seemed richer, more putrid than he would have expected from poultry, even giant poultry. The barn was a massive, looming structure. The main doors were chained and padlocked. Peering through a grimy, cracked window, they could see little in the darkness within, just the vague shapes of machinery and hanging chains. It was around the back of the barn that they found it. A 50-gallon drum, rusted and stained, sat near a pile of discarded feed sacks. It was covered with a makeshift wooden lid, but a thick, dark liquid had oozed from under it, staining the ground a deep, greasy crimson. Flies, fat and iridescent green, buzzed in a frantic, greedy cloud around the drum. The smell here was overwhelming, a physical force that hammered at their senses. "Miles," Lena said, her voice low and tight. He knew what they had to do. With a shared, grim look, he found a sturdy piece of discarded pipe. Using it as a lever, he pried the lid off the barrel. The swarm of flies exploded into the air, and both detectives recoiled, gagging. The barrel was half full of a viscous, bloody slurry. Mixed in with what looked like offal and animal entrails were other, disturbingly familiar shapes. What looked like scraps of clothing denim, a piece of a checkered flannel shirt were submerged in the gore. And then Miles saw it bobbing near the surface. A human hand. It was pale and bloated, but unmistakably human. On the forearm, just visible above the grotesque stew, was the faded, black ink of a coiled snake. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to shrink to the rim of that horrifying barrel, the buzzing of the flies, and the suffocating stench of death. The silence of the farm was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. "Get on the radio," Miles said, his voice a strained, gravelly whisper he barely recognized as his own. "Call it in. Get a judge on the line. I want a warrant for this entire property. And get backup. Get everyone." As Lena hurried back toward the car, her face pale and set, Miles stayed by the barrel, his gaze fixed on the grisly evidence. He drew his weapon, the familiar weight a small comfort in the face of this sudden, shocking horror. He scanned the silent house, the dark windows of the barn, the vast, dusty paddocks. His eyes fell on the ostriches. The big one, the one that had hissed at them, was standing by the fence again, watching him. Its head was tilted, its huge, dark eye a fathomless, black pool. And as Miles watched, the creature opened its beak and let out a series of deep, booming calls that echoed across the desolate landscape. It wasn't a sound of alarm. It sounded like anticipation. The knot in Miles's stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. The smell, the barrel, the woman's spirit was all clicking into place in the most monstrous way imaginable. The ostriches weren't just being raised for meat. They were being fed. The full weight of what that implied was so grotesque, so far beyond the pale of normal human depravity, that his mind recoiled from it. But the evidence was right there, floating in a barrel of blood. This wasn't just a murder. It was a disposal system, a farm-to-table horror story where the table was a dusty paddock and the diners were giant, carnivorous birds. The dust of Havenwood had finally settled, and it had revealed a nightmare. The long, terrifying day at the Albright farm had only just begun. The arrival of backup was a jarring intrusion of the modern world into the farm's timeless squalor. The crunch of tires, the crackle of radios, and the flashing blue and red lights felt alien against the backdrop of the decaying house and the silent, watching birds. Judge Miller, woken from his afternoon nap, had signed the warrant without hesitation the moment Lena uttered the words "human remains." Now the Albright farm was a full-blown crime scene. Miles directed the first two deputies, young, eager men named Evans and Clark, to secure the house. "She's in there. Martha Albright. Husband's name is Hezekiah. He's not on the premises, according to her. She's hostile. Go in careful." They approached the house with weapons drawn, a stark contrast to the casual knock Miles and Lena had attempted less than an hour ago. There was a brief, shouted command, the splintering crack of a battering ram against the old wooden door, and then they were inside. A few moments later, Evans's voice came over the radio. "House is clear. We have one female in custody. No sign of the husband." Martha Albright was brought out in handcuffs. In the harsh light of day, she looked even more skeletal, a creature made of wire and bone and simmering rage. She didn't struggle or shout. She just stared at Miles as they led her to a patrol car, her pale eyes filled with a venomous, chilling hatred. It wasn't the look of a panicked woman caught in a crime. It was the look of a queen whose castle had been breached by barbarians. With the house secured, the real work began. The forensics team, a two-person unit from the county seat, arrived and immediately set to work on the barrel and the area around the barn. Miles and Lena, now clad in protective booties and gloves, prepared to enter the barn itself. The padlock on the main doors was thick and rusted, but a pair of bolt cutters made short work of it. The heavy doors groaned open, releasing a wave of stale, hot air thick with the smell of blood, manure, and old hay. Light from the open doorway cut a swath through the gloom, illuminating a scene of industrial-scale butchery. The center of the barn was dominated by a huge, metal processing table, its surface deeply scored and stained a dark, permanent brown. Above it, a heavy-duty winch and pulley system was bolted to the rafters, thick chains with wicked-looking hooks hanging down. The concrete floor was sloped towards a central drain, and the entire area was splattered with old, dried blood. It was a setup for processing large animals. But something was wrong. "Look at the height on those hooks," Lena said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "They're low. Too low for hanging a carcass the size of a cow or even an ostrich, for that matter. You'd hang those by the legs, right? To let them bleed out." She was right. The hooks hung only about 5 feet from the floor, the perfect height for a human being. Miles felt a cold dread snake up his spine. He swept his flashlight beam around the barn. Against the far wall were several large, chest-style deep freezers, their white enamel exteriors grimy and stained. A heavy-duty meat grinder, the size of a small engine, stood next to them, its auger and plates caked with a dark, dried substance. "Forensics is gonna have a field day in here," Miles muttered. Lena walked over to the first freezer and lifted the heavy lid. A wave of freezing air rolled out. It was packed solid with large, plastic-wrapped parcels of meat. Most were labeled in a neat, blocky script: ostrich thigh, ostrich breast. "Seems normal enough," she said, her breath fogging in the cold air. She moved to the second freezer. It was the same. The third, however, was different. The packages were wrapped in the same white butcher paper, but they were unlabeled. And their shapes were wrong. They weren't the uniform cuts of a large bird. They were irregular, lumpy, some long and thin, others thick and squat. Lena picked one up. It was heavy and frozen solid. With a gloved hand, she carefully tore a corner of the paper. Underneath, the frozen flesh was pale, almost white. She tore it a little more. Miles trained his flashlight on the object, and his blood ran cold. They were looking at a human foot. Lena dropped the package back into the freezer with a clatter, snatching her hand back as if burned. She stumbled back, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. "Oh God, Miles," she breathed. "The whole freezer." He stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs, and lifted another package. This one was long and cylindrical. He didn't need to open it. He could feel the unmistakable shape of a human femur beneath the paper. They weren't just killing people and feeding the scraps to the ostriches. They were butchering them, processing them like cattle. The unlabeled packages, the low-hanging hooks, the industrial meat grinder, it was a human slaughterhouse. The sheer, calculated evil of it was staggering. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a system, an operation. The Albrights had created a factory of death on their isolated patch of dirt. They backed out of the barn, a shared, unspoken need for fresh air driving them. They stood in the fading afternoon light, the sounds of the active crime seen a dull hum in the background. They were both seasoned detectives. They had seen terrible things. But this was different. This was a glimpse into a darkness so profound it felt bottomless. Who were they? Lena asked, her voice shaking. Leo Croft was one. But this has been going on for a long time. How many more? It was the question that now hung over the entire investigation. The barrel held the remains of one man. The freezer held the parts of God knows how many others. Miles's gaze drifted towards the ostrich pens. The birds were still there, watching, always watching. Their prehistoric eyes seemed to hold a kind of knowing patience. They were witnesses, and accomplices, and the final, horrifying destination for the victims of this farm. He thought about the meat labeled ostrich in the other freezers. Was it really ostrich? Or was it something else, packaged and labeled for some unspeakable purpose? Were they selling it? The thought was so vile, so monstrous, that he couldn't even fully process it. Just then, Deputy Clark jogged over to them, his young face pale and strained. "Detective Corbin? You need to see what we found in the house." The interior of the Albright house was as grim as the exterior. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust, decay, and unwashed bodies. The sparse furniture was old and worn, the wallpaper peeling in damp, brown curls. It was a house that had been slowly dying for years. In what passed for a living room, a collection of evidence bags sat on a rickety coffee table. Clark pointed to one of them. In the master bedroom, under a loose floorboard, Miles picked up the bag. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, the kind used for old-fashioned bookkeeping. Its cover was worn smooth with age and handling. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with the same neat, blocky handwriting they'd seen on the freezer packages. But this wasn't a record of finances. It was a logbook. Each entry began with a date, followed by a name or a brief description. August 12th. The hitchhiker. Male approximate 25. Scrawny. Fed the east paddock. September 3rd. Maria. Female, 30s. Ran out of gas on the Ridge Road. Put in the freezer. Good marbling. October 21st. The salesman. Male, 50s. Portly. Ground stock. Page after page it went on. A meticulous, chilling record of murder, stretching back for years. Some entries were just a few words, others contained cold, detached observations about the victim's physique or the quality of their meat. The last entry, dated just 6 days ago, read, "The Drifter. Leo. Male, 40s. Wiry. Complained too much. Barrel scrap." Miles felt a wave of nausea. He handed the ledger to Lena, who read a few entries before closing it abruptly, her face ashen. "Good marbling," she whispered, her voice filled with disgust. "He writes about them like they're livestock." "To him, that's exactly what they were," Miles said grimly. This ledger changed everything. It was a confession, a damn shopping list of victims. And it was proof that Hezekiah Albright, the unseen, biblical-named husband, was the architect of this horror. Martha was his accomplice, but the cold, methodical cruelty in these pages had to be the work of the farm's master. An officer called out from the kitchen, "Detectives, we've got something in here." The kitchen was small and filthy, with grease-caked walls and a floor sticky with years of grime. On a small, butcher-block table in the corner sat a plate with the remains of a half-eaten meal. It was some kind of stew, the meat dark and stringy. Next to it was a cookbook, open to a recipe for hearty ostrich goulash. But it was what was in the sink that drew their attention. Soaking in a pot of murky water were several large, heavy-looking bones. They were too thick, too dense for any kind of poultry, even an ostrich. One of them had a distinct ball-and-socket joint, a human hip bone. They had been eating their victims. The depravity of the Albrights was a bottomless pit. Each new discovery was a descent into a deeper, more unthinkable level of horror. They weren't just killing people to feed their animals. They weren't just butchering them to store or sell. They were consuming them, sitting in their filthy house and dining on the men and women they'd lured to their deaths. As dusk began to settle over the farm, casting long, eerie shadows from the fence posts, a sense of grim reality set in. They had one suspect in custody, but the main architect, Hezekiah Albright, was still at large. He could be anywhere, and he knew they were here. He wouldn't be coming back. The search was now on for a monster, a man who saw his fellow human beings as nothing more than a source of protein. Miles walked back outside, leaving the oppressive atmosphere of the house behind. He stood and looked out at the darkening landscape, at the silhouettes of the ostriches moving restlessly in their pens. The case of the missing drifter had cracked open a door to a world he never wanted to know existed. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the full story of the Albright horror farm was far from over. Hezekiah was still out there, and the ledger in that evidence bag was a testament to how many people had learned the terrible secret of what the ostriches ate. The week that followed the discovery at the Albright farm was a blur of fluorescent lights, cold coffee, and the grim litany of horror that spooled out from the evidence logs. The farm itself was a quarantine zone, crawling with state investigators and forensic anthropologists who were undertaking the gruesome task of excavating the paddocks. The initial reports were stomach-churning. The dusty soil of the ostrich pens was littered with human bone fragments, some gnawed and splintered by the powerful birds, others partially buried. They found belt buckles, shirt buttons, the metal grommets from a pair of hiking boots, and a single small silver earring. Each item was a silent testament to a life cut short and fed to the residents of this abattoir. Martha Albright remained a stone wall. She sat in her interrogation room at the county jail, a wraith in an orange jumpsuit, and said nothing. She stared at the wall, at her hands, at the two-way mirror, her pale eyes holding a placid emptiness that was more terrifying than any ranting or denial. She had retreated to a place deep within herself where the detective's questions couldn't reach her. She requested no lawyer, spoke to no one. She simply existed, a living vessel for the farm's unspeakable secrets. The ledger was their Bible and their curse. The names and descriptions within it launched a nationwide effort to identify the victims. The hitchhiker, Maria, the salesman, they were ghosts. Using missing persons databases, they began the painstaking process of trying to put faces and histories to Hezekiah's cold, callous entries. They got a potential hit on Maria, a woman from a neighboring state who had vanished 2 years prior after her car broke down on a desolate highway. Her last cell phone ping was near Miller's Ridge. The silver earring found in the paddock matched a pair she was wearing in her DMV photo. It was a small victory that felt like a profound defeat. But the central figure in the nightmare, Hezekiah Albright, had vanished as if he'd never existed. His driver's license photo, a grainy 10-year-old image, showed a severe-looking man with deep-set eyes, a gaunt face, and a thin, lipless mouth. It was a face that promised nothing and expected the worst. His records showed he had no living relatives. He'd bought the farm 30 years ago with cash and had lived off the grid ever since. He paid his property taxes on time via mail order, and that was the only interaction he seemed to have with the outside world. He was a ghost long before he became a fugitive. An all-points bulletin was issued. His face was on the news, on gas station bulletins, on the lips of every cop in a 500-mile radius. Yet there was nothing. No sightings, no credit card activity, no phone calls. It was as if Hezekiah had simply evaporated into the same dusty landscape that had hidden his crimes for so long. Miles Corbin became obsessed. The case consumed him. He slept in his office, subsisting on stale donuts and the bitter adrenaline of the hunt. The ledger's neat, blocky script was burned into his memory. At night, when he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the missing persons' photos they'd pinned to the incident board, their frozen smiles a stark contrast to the horrors he knew they'd endured. He saw the blank, knowing eyes of the ostriches. He saw the low-hanging hooks in the barn. "You need to go home, Miles," Lena told him one evening, her voice soft but firm. She'd been his rock through the whole ordeal, managing the flood of information, dealing with the press, and keeping him from falling completely into the abyss the case had opened before them. "You're running on fumes. You're no good to anyone like this." "He's still out there, Lena," Miles rasped, scrubbing his hands over his tired face. "He's out there, and he's not going to stop." This wasn't just a business for him. It was a philosophy, a way of life. People like that don't just retire. His words proved prophetic a few days later. A report came in from a county 2 states over. A trucker, found murdered in his cab at a remote rest stop. The local police were baffled. It seemed like a robbery gone wrong, but nothing of value was taken. The only thing missing was the man himself. The truck was there, the cargo was intact, but the driver was gone. The responding officer, a rookie who had been glued to the news about the ostrich farm murders, noticed something on the floor of the cab, half hidden under the driver's seat. A single, large, black and white feather. Miles and Lena were on the road within the hour. The rest stop was a lonely island of asphalt in a sea of cornfields. The truck, a big Peterbilt, was already cordoned off with yellow tape. The local sheriff, a weary man named Wallace, filled them in. Driver's name was Gary Newman, Wallace said, chewing on an unlit cigar. Found by another trucker this morning. Cab door was unlocked, keys in the ignition. A hell of a lot of blood on the driver's seat, but no body. We searched a 2-mile radius. Nothing. It's like he just vanished. Miles looked inside the cab. The bloodstains were extensive. This was a violent, frenzied attack. He saw the feather now in an evidence bag. It was unmistakable. An ostrich feather. He's using it as a calling card, Lena said, her voice tight with a mixture of dread and excitement. He's taunting us. It's more than that, Miles replied, his mind racing. He's improvising. He doesn't have his farm anymore. He doesn't have his disposal system, but he still has the hunger, the need. So he takes the body with him. The thought of what Hezekiah might be doing with Gary Newman's body was too horrific to contemplate. They were no longer just hunting a killer. They were hunting a ghoul who was now a nomad. The investigation into Hezekiah's past yielded almost nothing. He was a phantom, born in an unincorporated town that no longer existed, his birth certificate a flimsy, handwritten document. No school records, no military service, no tax history before he purchased the farm. It was as if he had been born the day he bought that patch of land. The breakthrough, when it came, was from an unexpected source. An archivist at the state capitol, an elderly man with a passion for local history, had been following the case. The name Albright and the location Miller's Ridge had rung a faint bell. He spent 2 days digging through dusty, forgotten county records and land deeds. What he found, he faxed to the Havenwood Sheriff's Department. The farm had not always belonged to Hezekiah. For nearly a century before, it had been the site of the Miller's Ridge Poor Farm, a county-run institution for the destitute, the mentally ill, and the socially undesirable. It was a place of rampant abuse, neglect, and misery, finally shut down in the 1950s after a public scandal involving the unexplained deaths of dozens of residents. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the property, and the name of the final, notoriously cruel warden of the poor farm, Silas Albright, Hezekiah's grandfather. It's in his blood, Miles said, staring at the fax documents. This land, this place has been feeding on the forgotten for generations. First the poor and the sick, now the drifters and the lost. Hezekiah wasn't the start of the rot. He just perfected it. Hezekiah had inherited not just the land, but the ideology. A belief that some people were less than human, that some people were merely livestock, to be used and consumed by those who deemed themselves superior. His grandfather had done it under the flimsy guise of state authority. Hezekiah had shed the pretense and embraced the core, carnivorous truth of his family's legacy. Armed with this new understanding, Miles decided to try a different approach. He went back to the jail, back to the silent, watching Martha. He didn't bring a file or a list of questions. He brought the old, faded photograph of Silas Albright that the archivist had found. He sat across from her in the sterile interrogation room and slid the photo across the table. This was his grandfather, wasn't it, Martha? Miles asked, his voice quiet. Martha's eyes, which had been fixed on the wall, flickered down to the photograph. For the first time, a crack appeared in her placid facade. Her lips, thin and bloodless, trembled slightly. Hezekiah. He worshipped him, she whispered, her voice a rusty creak from disuse. Said his grandfather understood the natural order of things, that there are predators and there is prey, and that the world was full of prey, just wandering around, waiting to be harvested. The dam had broken. For the next 2 hours, Martha Albright talked. She told them how she'd met Hezekiah when she was just a teenager, a runaway who'd fallen under the spell of the intense, quiet man who offered her a home. She spoke of his philosophy, a twisted mix of social Darwinism and a kind of self-made religion centered on the land and the birds. The ostriches. He called them the old gods. she said, a strange, reverent light in her eyes. He said they were ancient, pure. They didn't have souls clouded with guilt or pity. They just consumed. He said feeding them the weak was an act of worship. It purified the land. She told them how it started years ago with a hitchhiker who had tried to rob them. Hezekiah had killed him in a fit of rage, and in a moment of what he called divine inspiration. He had butchered the body and fed it to his flock. He claimed the birds had never been healthier, their eggs never larger. It became a ritual, a sacrament. He said the world wouldn't miss them, Martha said, her voice devoid of emotion. That they were ghosts, people with no ties, no one to look for them. He was just cleaning up, making things tidy. Miles listened, his skin crawling. Hezekiah wasn't just a murderer. He was a high priest of his own grotesque religion, with his wife as his sole acolyte and a flock of giant birds as his deities. Where would he go, Martha? Miles pressed, leaning forward. He's out there now without his temple. Where would a man like that go? Martha looked at the photograph of Silas Albright again. A slow, strange smile touched her lips. He always said that if the world ever came for him, he would return to the beginning, she said. To his grandfather's heart. The place where the first harvest was sown. Miles and Lena exchanged a look. The old poor farm cemetery, Lena breathed. The unmarked graves. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. The gravesite was on a remote corner of the Albright property that hadn't been a primary focus of the investigation. It was a barren, windswept hill, marked only by a few crooked, weather-beaten wooden crosses that had been pounded into the earth decades ago. They assembled a small, heavily armed tactical team. As they drove back out the familiar, dusty road to the farm, a grim sense of finality settled over them. They were going to the heart of the Albright legacy, to the source of the poison that had seeped into this land for a century. They parked the vehicles a half-mile away and approached the hill on foot as the sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and purple. The air grew cold, and the wind whispered through the dry grass. As they crested the hill, they saw it. A freshly dug grave, the mound of red earth stark against the dying grass. And standing beside it, his back to them, was a tall, gaunt figure. He was holding a shovel, his movements slow and methodical as he patted down the soil. It was Hezekiah. He didn't seem to have noticed their approach. He was completely absorbed in his task, a farmer tending his final crop. Hezekiah Albright, Miles shouted, his voice carried on the wind. Drop the shovel. Put your hands in the air. Hezekiah froze. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time Miles saw the man from the photograph in the flesh. He was older now, his face a roadmap of hard lines and deep-set shadows, but the eyes were the same. They were flat, cold, and utterly devoid of fear. He looked at the assembled officers not as a cornered animal, but as a man interrupted at his holy work. He looked down at the fresh grave at his feet. It was small, too small for an adult. On the ground next to it lay the blood-soaked jacket of Gary Newman, the murdered trucker. But the body he was burying was not the trucker's. Hezekiah let the shovel fall from his hands. He raised his arms slowly, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "You're too late, detective," he said. His voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to come from the earth itself. The harvest is already home. He had not buried the trucker. He had done something else with him, something that fit his ritual. And in that moment, looking at the small grave on that haunted hill, Miles understood. Hezekiah hadn't fled to escape. He had come home to complete his final sacrament. The nomadic ghoul had returned to his desecrated church. The confrontation they had been hunting for was finally here, on a hill of forgotten bones, with the ghost of the Albright farm made flesh at last. The standoff on the hill of unmarked graves was thick with a silence that felt older and heavier than the coming night. Hezekiah Albright stood with his hands raised, but there was no surrender in his posture. He was a statue of defiance, his gaunt frame silhouetted against the last bloody gashes of sunset. His eyes, cold and dark, were fixed on Miles. "You've trampled my garden, detective," Hezekiah said, his voice carrying easily on the cold wind. "You've disturbed my flock. You do not understand the sanctity of this place." "The only thing I understand is that you're a butcher and a cannibal," Miles shot back, his rifle steady on Hezekiah's chest. "We know about the ledger. We know about the freezer. It's over." Hezekiah let out a dry, rasping chuckle. It was a sound like stones scraping together. "Over? Nothing is ever over. It is simply composted, recycled. The trucker, Mr. Newman, he has returned to the earth." "Not here," he said, gesturing to the small grave with his chin. "His flesh has been given as an offering, a final meal for the old gods. I brought their food to them." A cold sickness washed over Lena. "What are you talking about? The ostriches are in their pens." Hezekiah's smile widened. "The pens were a temporary convenience, pantry, but their true temple, their home, is much larger." A sudden, booming cry echoed from the scrubland behind them, a deep, guttural sound that was horribly familiar. The tactical officers shifted nervously, their weapons swiveling towards the noise. Another call answered it from the right, and then another from the left. "The fences." Miles breathed, a horrifying realization dawning. "When we focused on the house and the barn, he must have come back. He cut the fences. They were surrounded." Hezekiah had released his flock. The dozens of giant, carnivorous birds were now roaming free in the twilight, and he had led the police directly into the middle of their new feeding ground. The rustling in the tall, dry grass was no longer the wind. It was the sound of powerful, two-toed feet stalking through the undergrowth. "They are timid in the light of your world," Hezekiah continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a preacher. "But in the shadows, they remember their nature. They remember that they are gods. And gods are always hungry." From the gloom, a massive shape emerged. It was the big male ostrich, the one that had watched them on that first day. Its huge, black eyes gleamed in the fading light, and its head swiveled on its long neck, appraising the new arrivals. It took a step forward, then another, its movements both jerky and unervingly fluid. "Get on the ground, Hezekiah. Now!" the tactical team leader yelled, his voice strained, but Hezekiah ignored him. He lowered his hands slowly and took a step back, closer to the small grave. "This grave is not for the trucker," he said calmly. "This is for my grandfather, Silas. I brought him a gift, a final piece of the harvest." He kicked at the mound of fresh dirt. A small, white object rolled out. It was a human skull. It was too small to be an adult's. Miles's blood ran cold as he thought of the missing persons reports they still hadn't been able to connect to the ledger. The dozens of entries that were still just descriptions. The situation was deteriorating into a nightmare. They were in an open field with limited visibility, surrounded by creatures they now knew were conditioned to see humans as food, all orchestrated by the madman in front of them. "Fire a warning shot," Miles commanded. A single rifle crack split the air. The big ostrich let out a furious, hissing roar and took a step back, but it didn't flee. Instead, its posture became more aggressive, its wings slightly raised. From the darkness on all sides, more shapes were emerging, their tall, sinuous necks rising from the grass like periscopes. "You see," Hezekiah purred, "you cannot scare a god with thunder. You only remind him of his power." He then did something utterly insane. He turned his back on the armed officers and began to walk calmly towards the massive male ostrich. "He's going to get himself killed," one of the deputies muttered. "No," Lena said, her eyes wide with horrified understanding. "It's a diversion." As Hezekiah approached the bird, he began to speak in a low, crooning voice. The ostrich, which had been agitated, lowered its head, its aggression seemingly melting away into a state of calm recognition. It was the shepherd approaching his flock. And while every eye was on the surreal spectacle of the killer communing with his monster, a flash of movement came from the right. Another ostrich, moving with incredible speed, burst from the scrub and charged directly at the line of officers. It wasn't a random attack. It was a coordinated pincer movement. "Contact right!" someone screamed. The world exploded into chaos. The officers, trained for human combatants, were completely unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the attack. The bird was a 9-foot-tall battering ram of muscle and bone. Kicked out with one of its powerful legs, a single, disemboweling slash. One of the tactical officers screamed and went down, clutching his stomach. The air was filled with shouting and the deafening roar of automatic weapons fire. The charging ostrich staggered, its body ripped apart by the volley of bullets, and collapsed into a heap of bloody feathers. But the attack had served its purpose. In that moment of chaos, Hezekiah had vanished. He had used the birds as a screen and melted into the darkness. "He's gone. Eyes up!" Miles yelled, sweeping his light into the gloom. But they were in a kill box. The sound of gunfire had agitated the entire flock. From all sides, the birds began to charge. It was a terrifying, prehistoric onslaught. The creatures they had only seen as weird livestock were now a pack of velociraptors, attacking with terrifying speed and ferocity. The next few minutes were a desperate, frantic battle for survival. Flashlight beams cut wildly through the darkness, illuminating huge, staring eyes and gaping beaks. The boom of shotguns and the crack of rifles echoed across the ridge. Another officer was kicked, his leg broken with a sickening snap. The birds were surprisingly resilient, their dense bodies absorbing rounds that would have stopped a man cold. Miles and Lena fought back to back, a small island in the swirling chaos. Miles emptied his handgun at a charging bird, the bullets seeming to have little effect until he managed to hit it in the neck, bringing it down in a thrashing heap. Lena, a better shot under pressure, was methodically placing rifle rounds into the creature's small heads, the only reliable way to stop them. "We have to fall back to the vehicles," Miles shouted over the din. "Cover the wounded." They began a fighting retreat, dragging their injured comrades with them. The ostriches pressed the attack, a relentless wave of beaks and claws. Their booming calls a terrifying chorus in the night. It was a scene from a primal nightmare, modern firepower against a savage, ancient fury. By the time they reached the relative safety of the patrol cars, the attack subsided. The surviving birds, seeming to sense their advantage was lost, faded back into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. The aftermath was grim. 2 officers were seriously injured. Another had a broken leg. The ground of the barren hill was littered with the grotesque, feathered carcasses of half a dozen ostriches. But Hezekiah was gone. He had orchestrated the entire scene. He had led them there, used his flock as a weapon and a diversion, and then slipped away during the battle. He had turned his own crime scene into a perfectly executed ambush. The drive back to Havenwood was silent, the adrenaline giving way to a cold, grim exhaustion. They had Hezekiah's confession in the ledger. They had his wife in a cell. They had a farm full of human remains. But the man himself, the architect of it all, had faced them down and won. He had made them dance to his tune and then vanished, leaving them bleeding in the dark. Miles sat in his office the next morning, staring at the incident board. Hezekiah's face stared back at him. Miles had underestimated him. He had seen him as a simple, brutish killer, a monster hiding on a farm. But Hezekiah was something more. He was intelligent, cunning, and operating on a logic so twisted and alien that it was almost impossible to predict. He wasn't just insane. He was the prophet of his own terrifying reality. Lena walked in holding 2 cups of coffee. She looked as exhausted as he felt. "State police have set up a perimeter around the entire ridge," she said, handing him a cup. "They're doing a grid search with dogs and thermal imaging. They'll find him." "Will they?" Miles asked, his voice flat. "He's lived on that land his whole life. He knows every cave, every ditch. He's not a fugitive in that wilderness. He's the king of it." The days turned into a week. The search for Hezekiah Albright was one of the largest in the state's history, but it yielded nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of a campfire. The wilderness had swallowed him whole. The remaining ostriches were hunted down and euthanized, a grim but necessary task. The farm was sterilized, its buildings eventually slated for demolition, a monument to a horror the county wanted to erase from the earth. The story of the ostrich horror farm became a national sensation, a grisly piece of modern folklore. But for Miles Corbin, there was no resolution. Hezekiah's empty place on the incident board was a constant, mocking reminder of his failure. The case eventually grew cold. The media moved on, and the memory of the farm began to fade for everyone except those who had walked through that barn, who had seen that ledger, who had fought for their lives on that haunted hill. Miles retired a few years later, the shadow of Hezekiah Albright following him out the door. He moved to a small cabin in the mountains, seeking a quiet he could never quite find. Sometimes, on cold, windy nights, he would think of Hezekiah. He would wonder if he was still out there, living off the land, a ghost in the wilderness. He pictured him as an old man, gaunt and weathered as the rock, his eyes still holding that cold, predatory fire. He knew that men like Hezekiah didn't just stop. The hunger was too deep, too fundamental to who they were. And on those nights, Miles would lock his door and check the windows, and he would listen to the whisper of the wind, half expecting to hear the deep, booming call of a hungry god, a sound that would forever be the sermon of the predator, a chilling reminder that the world was full of prey, just waiting to be harvested. The garden had been raised, but the gardener was still at large, and the seeds of his madness were scattered on the wind, waiting for new, barren ground in which to grow.